You're listening to the STEMxm podcast, highlighting women in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And now, your host, Mel the Engineer.
Hello, and thank you for joining me for episode 27 of the STEMxm podcast. I'm your host, Mel the Engineer, and I want to thank you for rejoining me after a bit of a break I had. I'll quickly say that my experience at Unleash Innovation Lab was amazing, and also my time in the Netherlands for my Arcadis Quest was also awesome. So for both, I got to meet many amazing people and learn about some of the great things going on in the world of sustainability. So thank you for your patience while I was away. For today's episode, we have Rosa Hoyle joining us. Rosa is a laboratory technician at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, and Rosa works on a team that is researching potential cures for Alzheimer's disease. She has a really fascinating perspective to offer on working in the research world. So take a listen, and I'll rejoin you at the end to discuss announcements and show notes. Welcome, Rosa, to STEMxm. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So I want to kind of go back in time and talk about your early life. I really want to go through the timeline of your whole career. So could you tell us where you grew up?
I have grown up a few different places, but primarily in Missouri. My family currently lives in Prairie Home, Missouri, which is a teeny tiny town sort of by Columbia. I live on a farm there.
And when you were young, did you have an early interest in science, or was that something that developed over time?
It was definitely something that developed over time. I never really thought I'd be a scientist until really right up at the end of high school when I decided to go to college for it. I always thought I was going to do something like writing or journalism, but as soon as I started taking like real science classes in high school, I loved the ability to like pursue questions and how so many different things are unanswered in science still, and that's a possibility for me to explore those things.
Yeah. So was there anything specific that happened in one of those classes when you were in high school that really stands out to you, or an experience or a teacher that really sparked your interest?
I don't think it was one particular thing. One thing interesting about me growing up is that I was homeschooled pretty much my entire life. So that's what really got me started on science, is the fact that neither of my parents are particularly scientific people. So they basically just gave me a textbook and was like, here, learn what you want. So that really launched me off because I could explore different topics as much as I wanted to. And so I don't think it was any one thing. It was the fact that I could pursue any idea that I had in science. And the ability to like teach yourself has been super important for me in my entire career. So that's what really started me off.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So you were homeschooled and your parents didn't have expertise in a science area, and so you kind of had to just figure it out and develop it on your own.
Yeah, exactly. Like my mom is a college professor teaching English, and my dad's a farmer, so very different things.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Okay, so how did you decide where you were going to college, and then what was your decision-making process like for your major?
Well, I decided to go to the University of Missouri Science and Technology in Rolla, Missouri, and it was just like one of the options of a small state school that I looked into. But once I got there, what makes the school unique is that it's primarily engineers and science majors. And so they're really good at fostering a community of learning and being surrounded by people all interested in stuff that I'm interested in. It immediately appealed to me because it's not a school that's really based on like having a huge social life or on their image all that much, but they just have fantastic teachers. And that was a big thing, is the biology department was pretty small. And so I knew all of my professors and they were super welcoming as soon as I got there. And you could have this really like personal relationship where they made it so that you could pursue what kind of science you wanted to pursue. There wasn't really any set path that you had to do.
Interesting. So, do you know about how many students go to that school?
I think it's around, with the graduate school, it's around 7,000 to 8,000.
Okay, so it's a decent size, but it's small enough that,
yeah. Well, it's like 80% of it, I think, is engineers, and the rest of us kind of make up a smaller percentage.
Right. Okay, I'm curious, what do you think, or what do you attribute to the success of fostering this environment where people are really focused on their learning?
I think that's a hard question, but I think the thing is that you get people there that actually want to learn, that they're not just going to college for the sake of going to college. And when you have a community like that, people who are kind of on the fence can be motivated by other students. And that was a big thing for me, is like seeing upperclassmen or people in different fields than me really succeeding and doing such interesting things. And it motivated me to get involved. And that was a big part of my academic life, was being involved in lots of different clubs and programs and having so many different opportunities, because it's really like led by students. These students are doing so many different things. They have lots of like design teams where you're doing hands-on work. And for me, I did lots of research in like wet labs almost immediately when I got there.
Okay, so tell us more about that. How did you get into those lab research positions, and what were you doing at that point?
Well, I was a part of a biology club, and some of the upperclassmen who had already started doing research kind of opened it up for the rest of us. And we had an event where the professors came and talked about their research, and whoever had openings in their lab opened it up to any undergrad students who wanted to. And so I ended up working with this professor, Yuan Wang, doing lots of different toxicity research, I guess, is his primary thing. But I started off in pretty small position in the lab, and that's something they totally understand. Is it's like you're starting from ground zero. You don't know anything about lab work, but the professors are really good about teaching you how to do little things like pipetting or growing cells in a petri dish, and just starting off slow in that environment where you have lots of different students of different levels all helping each other learn the different things they need to do. You don't have to be intimidated thinking like, I already have to have these skills going in. And you just, over the years, learn what you need to learn and branch out to different students or professors and learn different techniques that can help you.
And it sounds like you got to work in several different labs. So what did they focus on? What did you get to focus on as you were doing this work?
Well, pretty early on, I started working on a project where a different lab, well, the thing is I really only worked in one lab, but we did collaborations with lots of different labs. So there was a lab in the chemical engineering department that had developed these glass nanospheres, which is not something I understand that much, which was pretty good because I don't have a super strong chemistry or engineering background. So working with other people who understand that sort of stuff really helped me. So my job was to develop a breast cancer model using rats. So we would take rats and inject them with a certain type of chemical that would make it so that they develop breast cancer. And so then you would put in these little glass nanospheres into the area with breast cancer. And then the idea that was going to go, that I unfortunately didn't get to be a part of because I graduated too soon, but you're doing targeted drug delivery. So I kind of got to do the more biology side and the animal research side, and the chemical engineering department worked on developing these different targeted drug delivery systems.
Fascinating. Okay, did you struggle at all with the animal side of this?
It was hard at first. I think something that really helped me is that I grew up on a farm, so I had pets and I had animals that were not pets, and that kind of distinction in my mind helped me understand that these rats are not your pets. They may be cute. Some of them were not cute. Luckily, they were the white kind with red eyes. so you could kind of create an emotional barrier for yourself. But that's something I got over really quickly. And the trick to animal research is it's just like having a respect for the animals and having a respect for the part they play in the larger goal that you're trying to achieve, and being aware of that, but at the same time knowing that they are a tool, just like your other tools in the lab.
Interesting. Okay, so walk us through what happened next. Did you know, based on this undergrad experience, that you immediately wanted to go to work in a lab and stay in a lab, or what happened after your graduation?
No, not necessarily. I'm really interested in a lot of different things. Like I love art and music, and that was always my passion before I got into science. But once I started working in the lab and had the opportunity to see what it would kind of be like as a career, I decided that at least was going to be the launching off point for me. So I worked for 3 years in my undergrad lab, I guess 2.5 years in my undergrad lab, and I did an internship at uh, University of Missouri. And so kind of having those experiences, I knew I wanted to stay in that field for at least the moment, which is why I decided to look into jobs in research labs, especially academic research labs.
Has anyone ever pressured you to go for a master's degree or a PhD?
Oh, for sure. Like that is definitely the regular path that as you're going through school, you pretty much see the people going off to med school, or you have people going to veterinary school or some sort of medical program. And then you have the people going into their masters or PhDs. And that's definitely what's laid out in front of you, and all the different like career classes and advice I had were along those lines. But watching other students go through that process, or students choosing not to go through that process, really helped me, because really there's a lot of different things you can do with your bachelor's degree, but there is quite a bit of pressure to go along those two routes.
Okay, so if someone else was facing that same decision, or even maybe a young person looking for paths that they can do with a bachelor's degree, what kind of advice or thoughts would you share with them?
Well, for me, something that has been incredibly important is having the opportunity to try to work in a field before I decide if that's really the career path I want to go down. So for me, for instance, my job right now is as a research technician. And so most research technicians, you only have to have your bachelor's degree, but you get to work alongside other scientists or other people in that field with higher degrees. And so now I can work like a 9 to 5 job doing what I thought I wanted to do, and really see if that's the opportunity for me. Because that's the hard thing about college, is it's just like you have these different careers that are laid in front of you, but if you never get the opportunity to actually see what it's like on a day-to-day basis, or see what it's like for what your career could be in the future, watching other people pursue those goals, then it's really hard to know what you want to do. And even like my experience I had as an undergrad in a lab is very different than the experience I have as a full-time worker in a lab. You don't have to make your decision right out of college. And that's really what I did with my job right now, is it's like this is kind of a pause where I can continue to develop skills, and I can continue to see what kind of opportunities I could have, but I don't necessarily have to know exactly what I want to do with my degree right now.
Right. Okay. Tell us a little bit more about what you meant by that statement, that the work that you do now is very different from your undergraduate work. What makes it different? And maybe you could also tell us how your early work kind of helped you get to where you are today.
Yeah. So in your undergrad, you're juggling a lot of different things. You have all your academic work, you have your social life, and if you're choosing to work in a lab, you have that. So really, I wasn't spending that much time in a lab. Probably like on average only 5 to 10 hours a week. And so doing that, where you're just kind of trying to slowly get into projects or helping other people with their projects, it's not exactly like being in the lab all day, every day. And the trick about science, and biology in particular, is that, well, at least my field with like molecular biology is that you have to do the same thing over and over again, trying to get your results. And it's not going to work every time. There's a lot of failure. And that really becomes clear when that's your entire job to do every single day. So there's like parts of it that are quite monotonous. And I don't think I understood that quite as much when I was an undergrad. But it's not that you also, the other side of that is you also get to see the success of your job when you're there every single day, which isn't something you entirely experience in your undergrad. Because, like, for me, I got to work on lots of different projects at my school, but I didn't really get to see them to completion. And so now, having a full-time job, I get to see it start to finish, and I get to play a part in multiple aspects of it.
Right. Okay, that's awesome.
And what was the other part of your question again?
Well, I was just wondering, in your view, when you look back on your experiences, how did your early experiences prepare you for what you're doing today? So maybe was there something that you thought, wasn't important or potentially even a waste of time that you can see now really prepared you for something that you do or work on?
Oh, yeah. Well, the biggest thing is having the opportunity to actually work in a lab, which is really something I had to pursue on my own at school. Like, they don't necessarily lay that out in front of you. You have to be responsible of asking a professor if you can come work in their lab. And I don't think I would be where I am today if I hadn't had that hands-on experience. Because it's very easy to just focus on your classes at school. And that is a very important part. But working in an actual lab, working with actual animals just gave me so much perspective about what you'd actually be doing from day to day in your job. And I watched lots of other students not have that opportunity and then get closer to graduation with no idea of what they actually want to do. And I'm not saying you have to like devote your entire life to working in a lab as an undergrad, but at least being in a lab some of the time and being in different labs, trying different types of research is really important to seeing what you would want in your future.
Right. I think that has some kind of embedded advice in it, which is, go and ask, because if you have the desire to do work in a lab while you're an undergrad, there's definitely opportunities. It may not be the first person you ask, but somebody would definitely be up for having your help and training you to help in a lab. So that's great.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And the fact that if you ask one professor, they might not help you, but they'll at least reach out to other professors. You'll make these connections. And I think that's the biggest thing about college that I wish people knew going in is it's not necessarily just about your classes. It's about networking and talking to other people. Because how are you going to know what you want to do if you don't see people actually doing it before you try?
Yep.
And you have those resources at school. You have professors that did exactly what you are trying to do right now, and they totally see where you're coming from. And so it can be intimidating to talk to someone in a higher up position like that, but they're totally there for you. That's their entire job. And talking to other students. Like that was a very big thing for me is like when I was a freshman and sophomore and I really had no idea what I wanted to do, I talked to people making those decisions about what they were going to do with their career. And I watched them go through that process. And it was very helpful when I had the time to do that.
Yep, that's great advice. Okay, so I want to switch gears a little bit. That gave us a really good picture of what you worked through and how you got to this place that you're at. But can you tell us about the lab that you work in now and maybe some of the responsibilities? And one thing I'd really like to hear from you is if you could kind of paint a picture for us of who works in the lab and who is responsible for what and how do all these positions interact together?
Okay. Well, so I work in a pretty big research lab. So there's lots of different levels of people and lots of different tasks that are having to be done. So I am kind of on the bottom since I just got there, and I have a research technician position. And so my job is to help facilitate other researchers, such as like the graduate students or what they call senior scientists, who are people usually with their PhDs who are not necessarily teaching, but doing more of the technical work in the lab and the day-to-day running of the lab. So I help a senior scientist develop and produce antibodies for lots of different things. And the interesting thing about my job is those antibodies that I'm developing are used for lots of different research projects within the lab. So it's kind of like we're our own little machine making a product for the other people to use.
Okay.
And so then
I just want to stop you real quick. So can you tell us in simple terms, what's an antibody and how do you make them in a lab?
Well, so they're originally made from the livers of mice, at least these are. And so then you get the specific type of antibody you want from the liver, and then it is grown in cells. So that's a big part of my job is culturing cells, which is just the term for growing cells, and then adding different chemicals that make it so that you're just getting that certain antibody. And then those antibodies are purified by using gel filtration, which is just, this is hard to talk about with, I'm trying to think of not science terms for all these things, but so you purify the antibody by running it on this gel that attracts the certain, like just the certain antibody. So you can cut out all the different parts that are in that cell. So you're just getting the one thing you want. Is that enough of an explanation?
Yeah, that's totally good. Still, though, what exactly is an antibody, and then maybe you could go into what's done with it from for the other projects.
Okay. So an antibody is a certain protein in a cell that kind of acts as a marker. So it makes it so that you can make connections in the cell so for our research, we use these antibodies to connect to certain proteins that we want to see inside of the brains that we're working with. So you develop an antibody that, for instance, is targeted towards A beta, which is a type of protein. So the antibody attracts the A beta protein so you can tell exactly where it is in the cell that you're working with. So it's like a little guide so that you can not look at the organism as a whole, but target it for the exact proteins you want. So it's just like zooming in and targeting whatever kind of question you have.
Okay, interesting. So you said it acts like a marker?
Yeah. So it uses it's a chemical connection where you're targeting certain proteins. So I do Alzheimer's research, and two of the big proteins you work with are A beta and tau. And those are just proteins that are present when the disease is happening, or they're in a larger presence when the disease is happening, and they are in certain parts of the brain. And you can look for those certain proteins to see what is going wrong with the brain. And so having the antibody, one antibody that is developed to target tau, you can then you use the antibody to look at just the tau, or you have an antibody that's developed to look at the A beta, and so it acts as a marker to look at just the A beta. So it's literally making physical connections when you're adding these like stains or different ways to visualize the brains.
Okay, so you're right. This stuff is hard to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe if we could kind of back out for a minute and just talk in really basic terms about Alzheimer's, and then what this research that you work on is trying to accomplish. Maybe we could get a better picture then. What do you think?
Yeah, Alzheimer's is this really huge, complicated disease in the brain, and so talking about it like the research that the lab is doing is such a tiny little portion of what the larger disease is that it's hard to talk about on the whole scale.
Yeah, I completely understand. Okay, so let's give it a shot. So I watched, and I'll share this in the show notes. I watched a TED Talk not long ago that was about Alzheimer's, and they kind of described it. So you correct me if I misunderstood it. So they kind of described it as one of the big things that happens in Alzheimer's patients is there's like stuff, I don't know if they call it plaque or what they call it, that kind of accumulates in the brain and prevents neurons from communicating with one another. So if I think it's called the synapse. So you have the synapse of two cells or whatever that need to communicate. If there's too much stuff that's accumulated between them, they can't communicate properly. Is that a pretty basic way to think about it?
Yeah, sort of. The interesting thing about Alzheimer's is it's really two different problems happening at the same time that are very similar, but what makes the disease so terrible is that they're working in conjunction with each other. So you have these two different proteins, A beta and tau, and they accumulate together. Something happens in the brain where they start to accumulate and they make these what they call plaques and tangles, which are just the protein aggregating together and making it so that the neurons can't communicate anymore. And so they're like, if you look at a picture of the brain, like a slice of the brain, there are literally little holes that are happening in the brain and little dots where these proteins are all aggregating together. So that means all collecting together in one place. And so, like, the more that happens, the worse the brain functions, and it makes it so the brain literally shrinks, and you start to see this atrophy all through the brain. And it starts in certain parts of the brain that, like, so the very first thing that happens with Alzheimer's generally is that you first lose your long-term memory. And then as more of this protein builds up, more of these tacks and tangles happen, then you start to lose more function of the brain. So that is like late term Alzheimer's, where people won't remember what just happened to them, and they no longer can be able to control certain parts of their body or remember to like swallow or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then take us the next step. So that's a really basic way for us to understand this disease that your lab does research on. So what's the focus? What are they trying to accomplish with the research that's happening right now in your lab?
Well, the lab primarily is trying to find a cure for these plaques and tangles. So that means something that's going to either make it so that these plaques and tangles don't develop in the first place, or once they start developing, making it so that they can break apart and not not stop the connection between the neurons. And so to be able to do that, you have to be able to target just the plaques and tangles, or there's other proteins in the brain that they believe also play a role, but those are the two primary focuses. And so right now they're trying to find different medications and different techniques to be able to target those plaques and tangles.
Okay, fascinating. Okay, so take us back into your lab. Who is working on what, and who's responsible for which pieces of it?
All right, well, I'm going to start from the top down because it's a little bit easier to explain that. So the whole lab works under this man called Dr. David Holtzman, who's the chair of the neurology department at Washington University. And so he oversees literally dozens of different researchers. And within his lab, you have lots of different smaller projects going on. So the next step down, he has different associate professors that work with him that are in charge of their own labs working on their own little projects. And then underneath them, they have graduate students that are in charge of their own personal projects, usually underneath his kind of their umbrella of what the larger project is. And then underneath them would be the research technicians, like my job, that are there to help facilitate the day-to-day workings of the lab. So all the different things that need to be done instead of just the project overall. And so interspersed between them are like the lab manager, and then you have different managers underneath them. So we have a manager that is specifically there for the surgery that is happening and the different animal work that we have. And then you have your senior scientists and like Tech 2 positions, where there's people that, like the woman I work with, is just there to make the antibodies or just there to do certain jobs in the lab, but on a higher level that like I wouldn't be able to do because I don't have enough training at this point. Or there's a woman there who helps clean the lab and do the dishes and make all the different solutions we use. So her job is super important because it's just like the day-to-day workings of the lab.
Right. And that, I'm sure what she makes has to be pretty precise every time.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just like a janitor position. Her job is incredibly important because she's making all of these different solutions that everybody in the lab is using. And so if she messes up, then that's the entire lab that's going to have to suffer because of it. So her job is super important.
Right. So you mentioned earlier that you make antibodies that are used by several different teams. Can you tell us anything about what these other teams are doing?
Yeah, so there's a few different really interesting projects that are happening in the lab. So one of them is that there's a interesting connection that people are trying to explore right now between type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's. If you look at the two different diseases, there's a really large connection in like the older demographic. So that's the trick about Alzheimer's, is everyone that you're studying is pretty much over the age of 65. And so there's a really strong connection between people with type 2 diabetes that are over the age of 65 and Alzheimer's. And so in order to study this, well, not that one necessarily, but they use those antibodies to target the specific proteins that they are seeing being affected by the problems caused by diabetes. Because there's this very strong connection between what's happening in the brain and what's happening in the rest of the body, as far as like your sugar content in your blood goes. And then so there's other projects where they're looking at different proteins in the brain that might be working in conjunction with the A beta and tau. And so in order to do that, they need the antibodies to look at just those proteins. So you're really just breaking up all the different intricate things that are happening in the disease and trying to target specific aspects of them.
Okay, that's really fascinating. Wow. Okay. So what would you say you enjoy most about your work?
What I really like is that they really foster continuing your education while you're there. And so I don't mean like going and taking classes, but educating yourself in your field. So when I got to the lab, I didn't really know anything about Alzheimer's disease. So immediately before I started any of my work, they had me read these scientific papers and talk to different people in the lab so I could get a really base understanding before I started anything. Because that's the important thing, is like, even though my job could be done by like what I like to say is it's like my job is like cooking, where I follow these recipes and make this product. But in order to do that, you have to have this larger understanding, or I guess in order to do it well, you have to have a larger understanding of what your ultimate goal is. And so they are very encouraging for us to go and listen to different seminars of people talking about the disease or talking about really anything we're interested in. And so having that ability to educate myself and learn more about a field that I'm fascinated with, as well as do my job, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, that sounds It sounds like a really caring environment. They really want you to be engaged in it, and they give you the time and space to do so.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's something really important about the lab is so since there's so many different people on different levels of their career path, they are really nurturing and they really want to foster your education and your career to continue in whatever direction you want to do. And that's the trick is there's people there that have all different intentions about what goal they want to reach in the future. So for instance, a lot of other lab techs that I work with are off to go to medical school or off to go to graduate school, or even some of the managers in the lab, the manager who's in charge of all the animal research, she only has her bachelor's degree and she decided she wanted to stay in the lab doing a tech position. And as she worked her way up and as she gained her expertise, she didn't feel the need to go back to school, but she's incredibly competent and can do so much, just as much as anyone with their PhD. But she just decided to have a different career path. And then, like the lab manager who's in charge of everybody and is absolutely vital to the entire working of the lab, she only has her master's degree. But same thing, she has been working for so long and has continued to educate herself and continued to work incredibly hard and gain these skills so that she is just as important as anyone with their PhD.
Right, absolutely. Those are great examples. Do you know what you are going to do yet long term? Have you decided?
Well, when I got the job, I was pretty sure I wanted to get my PhD and go to graduate school, partly because that's what I saw everyone else doing, and I assumed that's like what you
The
do. That's
path,
the
yeah.
only path in front of me. But being there and seeing other people in that future that it would have been what happened to me, I'm not entirely sure that's what I want to do anymore.
Mhm.
Partly because uh, I realize I really like working with the animals primarily. So I think I would like to go get my veterinary degree.
Oh wow, that's awesome. Okay, so so maybe several years later we can have another interview and you'll tell us about a
Yeah.
completely new field. That's great.
Well,
Okay.
that was the important thing is it's like I had no idea that that's what I wanted to do until I got to see people in the future I thought I wanted for myself, which I wish that could happen to everybody because that was just so important to me. Because it's like I don't even have to guess about, oh, if I got my PhD and I got a job in a research university, what would it look like? And then now I'm working with those people and I can say, oh, maybe that's not what I wanted. Because it's certainly what I thought I wanted in my undergraduate years, but now it's becoming super clear to me.
Yeah, now that you've gotten to see some other things and in particular see some people be successful in different ways. Yeah, I think
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, so I think it's great. Obviously, that's part of what I try to do with the podcast is show some of the different ways that people can be successful in science or engineering or whatever, because it can look like a lot of different things.
Yeah, and the biggest part about that is it's not necessarily just about education, because I think that's something that really intimidates people, especially about a PhD, is you see you have to get your 4 years of undergraduate school and then 5 to 7 years to get your PhD. And that's just such a large chunk of usually for people like the formative 20, like you're giving up all your 20s to work on a career that you're not even entirely sure you want to do. But it doesn't have to be like that. And it doesn't have to happen exactly after your undergraduate degree.
Hmm.
And that's something that I've appreciated seeing other people is there's people in the lab who did all manner of things before they decided they wanted to become a researcher, before they decided they wanted to get their graduate degree, or they worked in lab tech positions like mine for many, many years before they decided that they wanted to go ahead and pursue a higher degree.
Yep, that's great. I'm really glad that we got to discuss that aspect of what you've seen. So as you've been working in scientific research and in these laboratories, have you ever encountered any type of sexism in the workplace and how did you handle that?
Um, I wouldn't say directly. The thing that was hard for me at first is it's like, especially for people my age, all the people in positions of power are still really men in the academic field. And that's not 100% true, but like all the chairs of the department have been men, and most of the researchers were men. And so looking for role models was a little bit harder. And I don't know, like looking for people that I could see what I wanted in my future in positions of power was really kind of absent. So I wouldn't say there was any direct sexism, but not having role models was really hard to know what could have been out there ahead of me. Because it's intimidating to think that you're going to be breaking into a field where there's not a lot of women or there's not a super open environment.
I think some women find that intimidating, and maybe they don't even articulate it in that exact way in their mind. But it's definitely there. So I wonder if you might have any specific thoughts or advice for young women that are looking to go down a path in science or science research or even in the medical field, which is kind of where you're at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so for me, I overthink everything. And so I was always so concerned about, like, are people taking me seriously? Am I coming off as competent and smart? And having those worries nagging at me all the time was just very self-destructive. And not having women to look up to get rid of those feelings was really hard. But the thing is, if you let those fears overcome your goals, then you're not going to be able to get anywhere. So I guess I'd say just forget about what you think people are thinking about you and just try your hardest. Because that's the wonderful thing about science is people respect hard work, and really your results talk a lot more than your appearance, the way you're dressed or the way you talk to people. What people really care about in science is what you're publishing, what you're setting out into the scientific community. And so it's okay to be a trailblazer, and it can be intimidating, but as long as you work really hard at it, then I don't think anyone can stop you.
That's great advice. Thank you. That was really my last main question. So I'd just like to open it up to you for a moment and see if there's any kind of final thoughts that you want to put out into the podcast universe on, your experience as a scientist, and any recommendation you have for people that are interested in getting lab experience or going down a path similar to yours.
Yeah, so I guess my biggest advice for people that are either about to enter their undergraduate college or are just starting down that path, or even if you're close to the end, the most important thing that has happened to me is reaching out to others with the same interests as me. So whether that's professors or different students, but reaching out to them, getting the chance to have hands-on experience was just so incredibly important. And it can be intimidating. Like, I was terrified the first time I talked to the professor that I ended up doing research with. But all I had to do was send him an email and say, hey, I'm an undergraduate who is interested in working in your lab. Do you have any open positions right now? And once I took that leap, it was incredibly easy. He was super kind to me and super good about teaching me from ground zero. And I would not be where I am today without the work and care that he gave me.
That's awesome. Oh, great advice. So I just want to thank you again for joining us here today on STEMxm. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a wonderful time talking to you.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that chat with Rosa. I feel like her work and perspective is a really unique combo for what we've heard so far here on STEMxm. So I hoped it helped give you some perspective on life in a laboratory. You can find show notes for this episode in the usual place at STEMxm.com/episode 27. That's STEMxm.com/episode and then the number 27. I mentioned at the beginning that I had some announcements, and there is something I need to discuss with you, dear listener. STEMxm in its current form is not really working, which is to say, it's not reaching a wide enough audience for me to continue spending the amount of time I've been spending on it over the past couple of years. So it's really difficult for me to say this because I love making STEMxm episodes, and it has helped me to connect to so many wonderful women. So this is a time for a transition. In the not too distant future, we may be making some changes to the podcast, but there's also a chance I might need to let it go. If you've been listening regularly and would like to hear the podcast continue, and you would therefore like to be a part of the conversation about the changes made, please contact me at stemxm@gmail.com. As always, thank you for listening and for your support.
This has been an episode of the STEMxm podcast. Thank you for listening. We would really love if you could pop over to iTunes and give us an honest, positive rating. It helps more listeners find us to learn about STEM careers. Thanks again, cheers, and we'll catch you on the next episode.